Hello and welcome back to another Big Finish throwback review. Today I'm going to look at one of the most popular ranges from Big Finish, that being Doctor Who The Lost Stories. With so many scripts from the TV series that never saw the light of day for one reason or another, in 2009 Big Finish decided that they would acquire these scripts and adapt them for the audio format in order to give them a new lease of life. They began with the originally planned Season 23, the 6th Doctor's second season, before the show went on hiatus and the idea of Trial of a Time Lord took place of most of the stories. I've decided to take a look at each of these stories from Big Finish's version of The Lost Season 23 and see what they would have been like and whether or not we got the better choice of season. Doesn't really matter, I suppose, since now we have both, but it's interesting to look at them nonetheless. Before we get into the review though, I'd just like to say, if you haven't already, I'd greatly appreciate it if you support the channel by hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell to stay up to date with all the content I release. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and comment your thoughts on the Lost Stories below. Now for Big Finish's version of Season 23. Not all the stories are accurate representations of what that season would have looked like. Only a handful, specifically the first two and an additional story, were originally going to be part of the Season 23 block, while the rest were stories that were suggested around the same time. It's mainly going off of the stories that had the best scripts and the most to work with. Something I'll give all but one of these stories is, if you're not a huge fan of the more argumentative relationship between the 6th Doctor and Peri in Season 22, then this season of stories definitely shows a more positive and friendly relationship between the two of them. I'm not sure if that was always going to be the case with these stories when they were originally planned to be televised episodes, or if it was a result of the adaptation, and with Big Finish having formed out their own way of writing the 6th Doctor and Peri. But based on how they are in The Mysterious Planet, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt.
What's wrong?
Huh?
Can you still hear it?
Not now.
What sort of voice is it?
Siren song. Maybe I should lash myself to the mast.
Where does it come from, this voice?
That's what I'm trying to discover.
But where? I mean, where exactly was the last call from?
About where we're standing, I'd say.
Galactic Adventure.
See anything?
I'm not looking that hard.
Then you've presumably failed to notice your admirer.
What?
Shh, don't look. Young man, dark hair, standing by the ticket booth.
Where?
I said don't look! He's been with us since the amusement arcade. Seemed to take quite an interest in our conversation.
What should we do?
He looks harmless. Keep an eye on him, though. He's followed us this far, and I suspect he'll join us on the ride.
We begin with probably the most well-known of the Lost Season 23 stories, The Nightmare Fair, written by, surprisingly enough, the executive producer and showrunner of the 4th Doctor's seasons 15, 16 and 17, Graham Williams. The Nightmare Fair, along with Mission to Magnus, the second story, were definitely the stories that had the most work done and came the closest to actually being made, right down to being in pre-production and casting choices had already been made. As you can tell by the cover, the story would have seen the return of the Celestial Toy Maker from the 60s story of the same name. Now, in the original episode, Michael Goth was set to return. However, here he's played by David Bailey from the Robots of Death, and while it's not as good a performance, I still enjoy Bailey's interpretation of the character. Out of all the stories, this is one I was the most looking forward to, and unfortunately I was pretty disappointed by it. I'd say it's an okay story, but much like the episode The Celestial Toymaker, it doesn't take advantage of how interesting a concept this character is. The story mostly takes place in Blackpool Pleasure Beach, with the 6th Doctor and Peri enjoying a holiday following the events of Revelation of the Daleks, before being wound up in the Toymaker's plot involving a killer video game. Now, this story kind of suffered because of the shift to live action to audio, at least for part 1, as a good chunk of it is basically B-roll of the Doctor and Peri going around on fairground rides, which I'm sure would have been fun to watch, but less fun to listen to. Part 2 overcompensates by having them spend most of the time in a prison cell, which isn't very visually interesting. The second story is Mission to Magnus, written by Philip Martin, best known for writing Vengeance on Varos and Mind Warp. He was also the one who created the character of Syl, and it's clear that whatever was going to happen, Syl was a popular enough character that his return was inevitable. And comparing this story to the ultimate story Martin wrote, Mind Warp, we definitely got the better of the two. Yeah, this is also a one that was built up a lot, and not only is it just as disappointing as The Nightmare Fair, it's easily the weakest of this range, and I found it really difficult to listen to. I imagine a lot of people were excited at the prospect of having Syl team up with the Ice Warriors, especially since this was their first appearance since the mid-70s in The Monster of Peladon, and this was not a great return for them. This also introduces a character that would appear in Philip Martin's other Big Finish work, Antidote to Oblivion, the Time Lord Anzor and childhood bully of the Doctor. And let me tell you, this story doesn't get off to a great start, with the Doctor cowering under the TARDIS at the sight of Anzor on the scanner. It's not a very dignified moment. And remember what I said about this range treating the 6th Doctor and Peri pretty well? This story is the main exception, especially for Peri, whose treatment is arguably worse than what happened in Mind Warp. I think it's telling that at time of recording, this is the only story from the first wave of Lost Stories that you can still buy as a CD and hasn't sold out yet. So yeah, not a fan of this one. If you are keen to have another Syl story, I would recommend Antidote to Oblivion. It's much better.